Great. Okay. Now we're recording. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jean Devine. I'm one of the steering committee members, along here with Sarah Wang, Brucey Moulton, and Kim Andrade. So welcome to all of you from far away and near. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, Maya+Paula and Paula Phipps from Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. If you don't know anything about this organization, you should spend time not only learning about them and reading their website, but attending one of their conferences. They are fabulous. Maya is Outreach and Operations Manager. Paula is Associate Director. And Maya was the project coordinator for the project that you're going to hear about tonight, the Miyawaki Forest at Dannehy Park. So what we'd like to do is have them make their presentation. We'll open up to Q&A after that. And if you want to make comments in the chat, one of our team will be curating the comments to add to the Q&A. And we'll either call on you, or we may ask you to hit that show your hand, raise your hand thing on your screen, because it's pretty busy here tonight. All right, welcome, and you have the floor, Maya.
Great, thank you. So I'll share my screen, and I think we can kind of get started. Just making sure, can everyone, let's go presentation mode. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Great. So yeah, I mean, we're here to talk about the Miyawaki Forest that we did in Cambridge, and the Miyawaki Forest kind of as a concept and then as a project that we implemented at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. So I guess Paula can kind of start off by talking about Bio for Climate, and I will get us into slideshow mode. See if that works out for us.
Thanks, Maya. So basically, I know some of you do know about Biodiversity for a Livable Climate because I recognize a few names, but just to give you a little more of the story before you even go to the website, Bio for Climate was formed in 2013, a small nonprofit, and in 2014 put on its first conference. And basically, the title of that conference pretty much tells you what we are about, which was restoring ecosystems to reverse global warming. I don't think we actually talk anymore about reversing global warming, but aspects, like very much at the moment, talking about cooling. So since 2014, we've put on 13 conferences, 12 of them in person at, at Tufts, at Harvard, at Bristol Community College, and in the District of Columbia, because we have a DC chapter made up of folks who met each other at our first conference. So our conferences have been kind of seminal meeting places where people learn a lot, but also find each other and generate new ideas and new organizations even. So I guess the website goes into chat so you can find it. And there are, over 200 videos from speakers and Q&As, panels at the conferences, and they've been viewed over 270,000 times, even though we've never even advertised them. They are incredible. We have brought speakers from all over the world who are either scientists or practitioners on the ground working to restore all kinds of landscapes. So this particular picture in front of you comes from the conference on restoring water cycles to reverse global warming. And these were taken by a Slovakian hydrologist, Michael Kravchik, whose work is very important, and you'll hear more about it soon from us. We've had a conference on restoring oceans, on basically focused, although we haven't had a conference on forests, we certainly have had a number of speakers. Basically, we're talking about restoring all of the planet's ecosystems as the primary way to address climate change, global warming. The title Biodiversity for a Livable Climate is very much what we are about. Even now, the current COVID pandemic reinforces our title. We need biodiversity for a livable climate. Pandemics like COVID-19 actually are zoonotic diseases that come into our human sphere pretty much because we intrude on biodiverse places that need to be left alone. So with that kind of as the framing, most of our work is educational, both through the conferences, through a lecture series that we have with WGBH called Life Saves the Planet, and through now a series of mini conferences on nature's solutions as national policy, where we are trying to get policymakers aware and sometimes together with practitioners who can show them what is really working. Our next mini conference, which is a week from Saturday, is called Code Red Glasgow. What did they leave out? And we are bringing together an academic from Harvard, Andrew Refkin, who is has been the senior environmental journalist for the New York Times, but now is the head of a part of the Columbia Institute of Journalism that is dealing with climate change, essentially, and with La Via Campesina, which is an organization of millions of peasants around the globe who are in fact doing what needs to be done if we are to maintain a healthy, livable climate and planet, because it's the small farmers, the small landholders, the indigenous people who are actually producing the majority of food on the planet. And Maya's just put a link to that mini conference into chat. And it's really important. Andrew Refkin, as a journalist, is a really key person to help bring nature-based solutions into the climate conversation. And what we have really been about since 2013 is bringing biology into the climate conversation, which has largely been defined by physics and chemists, who were the original kind of framers of the concept in this century. So at any rate, that's what we're about in general. We don't usually do projects on the ground, but in 2020, our compendium editor, and Maya, maybe you can talk about the compendium, and I'm running over, had some articles in our compendium about Miyawaki forests, and then wrote an article that was published in The Guardian in May of 2020 called something on the order of Mini Forests Spring Up Over Europe to Aid Climate. And that article both convinced us to start doing something locally, but also many other people became aware of Miyawaki forests then. So we started working on, it's a year since we've been working on getting a Miyawaki forest in Cambridge, a really exciting process. And Maya will tell you about that because she was project manager and extraordinaire. So go ahead, Maya.
Sure. Thanks, Paula. So I kind of bombarded the chat with some links, and I'm sure I will have a chance to continue doing that. But for now, let's kind of hone in on some of, I guess, the context for this project in Cambridge and the ideas behind it. So Paula's talked a little bit about why ecosystem restoration is important to us, kind of viewing biodiversity and intact ecosystems as the backbone of, our water cycle, our carbon cycle, and kind of all of the things that make the climate the way it is and make it, as it has been, livable for the past many years. But of course, we've changed a lot of the way that the Earth looks. And so kind of the Miyawaki forest is part of a larger movement of, rewilding, restoring, regenerating, that is kind of going back to what works in nature. And there have been kind of numerous studies on the ways that trees help us out, and green spaces kind of make people happier and healthier, and of course also work on the macroscopic level to fight climate change, because they're sequestering carbon, helping soil absorb water, absorb carbon, trade nutrients, grow living things. So this is kind of all the backdrop for Miyawaki forests, which is like a type of approach to planting trees, to take hold. So the idea kind of started with Akira Miyawaki, who is a Japanese botanist, who actually passed away recently this year. But he was a pretty prolific kind of botanist and ecologist who, from his years of research and observation, developed this method as a way of not just planting trees in isolation, but taking what works so well in natural forests, which is the collaborative relationships between different tree species and with the life around it, the life in the soil, fungal and microbial life, and kind of all of the different moving parts of an ecosystem, and trying to recreate that. So he kind of pioneered this method in which you plant very kind of dense plantings of biodiverse tree species native to a region. And by planting them very close together and by kind of encouraging those relationships to develop in this way, he saw that these forests can grow very quickly and survive very well, and kind of mature in short spans of time. So his method took off in Japan. It's taken off in many other places around the globe. A-Forest, which is an organization, has done many, many forests in India. I think there's hundreds there now, and there are thousands across the world. I believe kind of over 3,000 total and over 4 million trees within that. And they took off in Europe, where Hannah kind of noticed them and brought them to our attention, and have slowly been gaining ground in America as well. And so that's kind of where we came in, thinking we could do this here. One hallmark, I guess I can go into the steps, but one hallmark, in addition to the biodiversity and the density, is the fact that they can start in really small areas. And so that is conducive to urban environments like ours. The fact that they can go as small as 1,000 square feet, which is not very big at all. It's about 6 parking spaces across. So this really caught our imagination, and we thought, how do we do this? So we ended up, and I'll walk us through kind of the steps of the method and the way that we in particular did these, but we ended up connecting to an organization called Sugi, which is a Swiss-based organization that has a network of forest makers and kind of helps fund and implement these projects around the world. So they connected us to our forest maker, Ethan Bryson, whose photo I think comes a little bit later in this slideshow. And he's based in Washington State and has done a number of forests in the US. And so he helped us kind of start this off by walking us through the steps and what this would look like, really making sure that we could implement this method well and have this kind of project go successfully in our kind of new area. So we started by finding a site, which was in some ways, theoretically simple, but logistically not so simple, because we had to figure out where this could go and how this fit into the city's broader plans and landscape. So we worked in the city of Cambridge with the urban forestry department, we were really lucky to connect to Andrew Putnam, who's the superintendent of urban forestry. And we had a long list of sites that, we had kind of either walked past or decided, this might be a good candidate based on its proximity to schools, to hospitals, to hotspots, to things that we thought were important, maybe kind of neighborhoods of low tree canopy and excess heat, things like that. But within this list, we really needed the information of, for the most part, with these public land parcels that were owned by the city, how we could actually get permissions to develop these and what other projects were going on. And so Andrew and his colleagues in the Department of Public Works and colleagues who, work on infrastructure, bike lanes, et cetera, kind of went down, annotated our list, and found a few possibilities that would work well in a short time frame, so that our project, which really started at the beginning of this year, could actually get planted this year, this fall. So that first step definitely could not be overemphasized. That was really huge. So we started by finding our site, and once we could do that, we actually
Maya, are you frozen?
technical at all. So that began with analysis to figure out
Maya, you're freezing. I'm not sure why. Can you ratchet up your sound maybe
back.
and get closer to the router or something?
Sure. Am I coming back better now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize for that. Sometimes I run into issues. I will kind of back up a little bit, and shout if I'm repeating myself. I was going to start by talking about our soil sampling. So once we found a site, we kind of proceeded from there. So the first part of this involved finding out what chemical and biological makeup of the soil was. So in particular, we wanted to boost the fungal content in the soil, have a high fungal to microbial ratio, because the kind of fungal mycelium is really a huge part of what aids the root networks to develop and what aids the kind of trees and plants in the forest to trade nutrients. So we also then developed a species list based on kind of what was appropriate to the region. And this was done by our forest maker, Ethan, with some help. So he kind of prioritized native species and ones that would be good for changing climate conditions in this area, but also kind of through someone he had worked with out west in the Yakama Nation in Washington State, Mary Lee Jones, they started forming a relationship with the Mashpee Wampanoag folks down here to try and factor in species that were important to the Mashpee, and not only were native to this region, but kind of served a purpose in the forest that once existed here. So kind of plants that were used for food or medicine or kind of products that would help in weaving and making houses, things like that. So created a long and wide species list, and then kind of fast forwarding a few months, once we had a planting day set, in the week before planting, did some kind of treatment of the area to kind of loosen up the soil, because soil compaction is a big factor in urban areas, and then add in some compost tea, some biochar, and really make sure that the site was ready
Maya, we've lost you. Maya,
Melissa,
Yeah.
you can't hear her yet at this point?
Maya has stopped talking, no?
Uh, you can't hear me?
Now I can.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
I can hear her.
Yeah, you were fine, Maya, I think.
Okay,
I
okay.
okay. All right, apologies again. So yeah, I guess I'll resume with planting, which happened on September 25th. And thank you all for your efforts if you joined in. And the planting is done very densely. So this is kind of one of the strangest parts of the Miyawaki method to many people. And I confess kind of took me by surprise too. It is a very, very dense kind of planting method. We planted these trees about 18 inches apart and have 1,400 trees in an area of 4,000 square feet. So this is kind of quite special. And then after planting, we have to maintain the forest for the first 2 to 3 years, doing 3 to play it safe. And they need some watering and some weeding to make sure that weeds don't come in and take over.
Maya, could I add something in here?
Sure.
So there's something very special about this site that was chosen because it's built over what was Cambridge's landfill for decades. So underneath 3 or 4 feet of soil, of really good soil, there is a dump. And it's it's a dump that I mean, it's a great reclamation and a great restoration project, but it also makes us aware that we have to have ongoing soil sampling before anybody would want to take something from the forest and eat it. And there are huckleberries and other edible things in there, but we'll have to monitor it closely. Yeah, we'll have to monitor it closely with soil sampling to ordinarily a Miyawaki forest or any really good stand of trees is remediating the soil under it. And the water that flows through there is actually getting cleansed. But just because of something special about this site, we'll have to monitor it closely, which you folks who might do a Miyawaki forest someplace else may not have to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Paula, for bringing that up. So, this kind of period of maintaining, or even after we're done kind of helping the forest establish itself, it doesn't mean that the forest has stopped changing, because things are still happening all over the place. Not only are these trees growing much taller and getting to kind of mature heights within the first or within 10 years or so, but there's also a ton of processes that are happening under the soil. And so we are really eager to do some analysis of how that's working and kind of find out what all is going on there under the ground. So let me, I guess, kind of scroll to some of the benefits that we touched on of Miyawaki forests. And as Paula said, soil remediation, which I don't think is on here, is kind of one of the ones that is definitely kind of part of that that kind of life-giving process of these forests, and something we're interested in seeing proceed here. In addition to that, Miyawaki forests and forests in general kind of make the ground porous and help soils retain water so that stormwater gets processed rather than flooding over or eroding the land. You're boosting kind of the native ecosystems with the native trees that are involved, because they provide both habitat and food for pollinators, insects and birds. You are using completely natural methodology rather than any synthetic chemicals. You have a very dense canopy filtering airborne pollutants. You can sequester carbon or carbon dioxide, and of course emit oxygen. And you also have this kind of rapid growth and high survival. The survival rate has been observed to be about 95% in Miyawaki forests, which is quite a high number. And that's kind of thought to be because of this density of planting and those collaborative symbiotic relationships. And then on the kind of human end of things too, it is a really beautiful experience to partake in this with a community. And a lot of people are really excited to take some of this direct action that's, creating a forest in their own backyards and creating something that will exist in decades in the city and make the city kind of a newer, greener, more resilient place. So, and as I mentioned, they can start quite small, and though they don't have to be 1,000 square feet or 4,000 square feet like ours is, that just helps kind of proliferate them through urban areas. In particular, we'd really like to see if there are any plots around schoolyards or old parking lots where a corner can be taken over, because especially with the cooling effect, where trees kind of through their participation in the water cycle and letting water kind of evapotranspirate out, they have been shown to really cool the surrounding areas and combat the urban heat island effect. And that would be really kind of remarkable near a schoolyard or kind of off of a city street. In a park, it's less necessary because there's already a lot of life there. But this is a really important aspect. Our attempts to make our cities more resilient. So I think that is another benefit that is really important to emphasize and kind of has a lot of potential, especially in selecting future sites, and kind of making this a method that can take on some issues of environmental equity as well, and environmental justice. So I'm going to keep going ahead with these slides. These illustrations I think are quite pretty, but I'm seeing someone in the chat, and I guess I'll wait till the end to do questions, but someone mentioned this kind of looks like a garden, and I'll show you some examples of the forest itself, and they don't quite look like gardens, which some people don't really like, but I think that's kind of one aspect of rewilding that is interesting to get into. But just some kind of comparisons is that the Miyawaki method is really attempting something quite different from conventional tree plantings, which tend to be, one species or at most kind of 2 or 3 species and far apart and don't have these root networks. And as a result, standalone street trees, for example, need a lot of care and often don't do so well, whereas kind of these types of plantings that are very dense and very biodiverse tend to be pretty resilient. So as mentioned, I want to show some examples of photos because I think it helps to see these in place. So there's some kind of examples in Japan in urban areas. I'm going to sort of fast forward to ones that I think illustrate the growth a little bit better. So one of the ones that Ethan worked on in Washington State in the Yakima Nation was done at a carceral or a corrections facility, and it used kind of traditional food and medicine plants from the Yakima Nation. And that kind of helped inform the process for us. And he also worked on a forest in Minnesota where, due to this nice kind of sculpture garden structure, you can really see the direct kind of size comparison of the trees after a couple of years. So on planting day, they're close and low to the ground, but within 2 and 3 years, they're nearly entirely obscuring these structures. And this is a lot kind of more indicative of what the forest in Dannehy Park will look like, which is, a bit wild and kind of bursting with these different types of species. And there are some flowering plants in it, but it is not your traditional landscaped area. And it's not, yeah, it's not exactly a garden. And so I guess I will kind of just showcase, before turning to questions, a little bit of the forest that we did. We have a nice kind of illustration as well, but that's a little bit less realistic than the photos from planting day. And kind of as mentioned, there's 1,400 trees and 4,000 square feet. And I will toss a link to kind of the webpage in the chat as well. But this forest was kind of done in a circular shape, and we have some aerial photos of before and after. There's a photo of Ethan, our forest maker, kind of demonstrating part of the planting process. I'm in the top corner there, saying hello. And we have kind of people involved in the planting, which was a really wonderful part of this experience, was just seeing a lot of folks from the area, a lot of families come out, and people really getting interested in getting their hands dirty and kind of learning from one another, learning what different species look like, making plans for what they wanted to see in their neighborhoods. Kind of just a really beautiful experience to be a part of together. So that is kind of the end of my story that I was going to tell. But I think there's some other details that we'll want to go over that I may have missed and may either be raised in questions, or Paula, if you want to jump in and take on some of the things I didn't talk about.
Sure. Sarah just asked about procuring the plants, and Cambridge has a long-standing contract with New England wetland plants in Amherst. And they provided the bulk of the, they provided a bulk of the plants, probably 1,000. They didn't have quite enough. And so two local ecologists, Russ Cohen, who some of you probably know, who's in Arlington, and Walter Kittredge, who's somebody who, what did he do? He graduated, he was a director at the Harvard Herbaria, and when he retired, he started a nursery in Reading, I think, and they both supplied free, in fact, some of the native plant species that we were missing. So that was fantastic. And essentially that's how we got the plants. As far as Ivan, what was your question that I just saw there?
That was on the plan for the planting, so the design. So I can talk about that one.
Sure.
So I guess maybe I can zoom in here and hopefully it will still render. We ended up kind of breaking the forest into sections on planting day to help arrange kind of volunteers so everyone would know where to go and we weren't all stampeding each other or stampeding the plants. So could, take care both in terms of COVID safety and in terms of kind of plant health.
And in this picture, the plants are all stacked up around the perimeter there. So.
Yeah, exactly. So the design was not, very precise where we had numbers on each bucket to say this needs to go in first, but there was some thought put into it of getting the taller kind of trees, the highest level of canopy to go in the middle, and that way they wouldn't kind of shade out the other plants within the perimeter. And so that design was kind of laid out so that the tallest plants, the ones intended for the middle, were set up closest to the middle. And then as you kind of circulated further out to the edges, you would have these kind of smaller shrub plants and kind of mid canopy and smaller trees intended for the edges. But that being said, it wasn't completely precise. There is a factor of randomness in there, but we wanted to generally congregate it that way.
We should mention that the women from the Yakima Nation came with Ethan, Mary Lee and her mother and daughter, and they're a family of healers and gatherers for the Yakima Nation, as well as Mary Lee being a social worker. And also a woman named Kat Williamson came from the Navajo.
Livingston, yeah.
Livingston came from the Navajo tribe, drove up from New Mexico to be one of the planting leaders. And there you can see Mary Lee in the middle and her mother and daughter. And Mary Lee did a blessing of the land at the beginning. If you do go to the Sugi website, you will see the blessing really up close. And at the end of the planting, she gave this is 7 or 8 hours later, she gave a kind of a closing blessing. And after she did, a rainbow came out over the whole area. It was quite staggering. Those photographs are on the Bio4Climate website. Yeah, so the presence of the Native American world has been very important in this particular planting. And the first 2 plants that were put in, trees, were actually one bush and 1 tree. In the very center were an elderberry and a chokecherry, because those are really sacred plants in the Native American world. And they also in the wild are often found right next to each other or close to each other. So there was actually a lot of kind of indigenous intelligence that went into thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of point to mention, and I appreciate that, Paula. And I think, I guess another question that someone asked was on Dannehy Park and why that was ultimately the site. And I guess the short answer of that was timing. We had really wanted to, we had this kind of ambitious list of possible sites, and we thought, hey, there's 40 on here, let's do all 40. And among those, let's start with kind of good areas for accessibility, for environmental justice, for air pollution remediation, heat remediation, et cetera. But in looking through the annotations that we got back, it became clear that there were about 3 sites, all of which were kind of in various locations in Dannehy Park that would be available on city land for a fall planting. And for kind of other sites that we had in mind, we'd have to wait until the spring or a little bit later. And so we just jumped because we wanted to see a first one go in the ground and go from there and kind of prove that this method worked, that you could plant this way. And after that, let's spread them through the city and get them into other areas as well.
And we were very pleased that the city, that Andrew Putnam really liked the idea from the start and saw this as a kind of a model and a first one for the city. And the city's arborist also has really, come in and really praised it. And although they may not follow the Miyawaki method exactly, it's clear that the city will in the future be planting much more densely and using more native species than they had been.
Yeah, so the question of protection, currently it's got some fencing around it, and that will stay up for the first few years while we're maintaining the site. And I should, I guess, talk about the maintenance a little bit, because all of you have the opportunity to get involved if you wish. The watering that is necessary for this forest is actually hooked up to an automated system. We're lucky in that this site at Dannehy Park has some water lines kind of right adjacent to the forest on the sides of it. So they've kind of put pipes in place to pipe the water up and out and water regularly. However, once the snows have passed, we're going to start weeding. And so that is going to be done on an ongoing basis. And we're overseeing that effort with the help of volunteers. So pretty soon we'll start kind of gathering the list of people who are interested. Many people, happily enough, really wanted to not just be there for planting, but have a hand in stewarding this forest. And so we're really excited to kind of organize that effort. And that will just be kind of a regular, maybe weekly basis, depending on people's availability, chance to go around the fencing and do the maintenance. But other than that, the fencing will stay up for those first kind of years while the forest is establishing itself. And after that will be taken down. I believe that's the plan. We haven't talked with the city about keeping it for longer, though it is on the side of a sledding hill. It is kind of sort of off near, see on the sides here, it's like adjacent to the walking pads and in the flatter area. So it's not right in the prime heart of things. So we'll kind of see how nicely people play with that. So and let's see, I guess for responsibility, I think we're kind of taking that on as well as the city. They're responsible for the watering and also kind of involved in its care. It's certainly invested in its success, and so are kind of going to help there. And then I guess we can talk about the cost breakdown as well, since the city helped pay for the trees and for soil amendments. And then Sugi also helped paid for some of the project as well.
So the total probably, with only our very rough estimate of the in-kind part that the city put in, the in-kind part, would be about $40,000. And Ethan tells us that the trees in this area, to buy them is much more expensive than when they do Miyawaki forests in other places. But that we ended up assuming it would be about 25,000, and then we, recently at somebody's request made a very rough calculation of what, and the city did a lot of work, and they also provided very high quality and large quantities of compost and biochar and compost teas. So yeah.
And I guess we should say that cost does kind of vary by region. And part of that was in kind of getting Mary Lee and her family and that kind of consultation out here, because that was an important part of how this forest got done, to have, that very deliberate process of planning and planting. However, I guess at least as far as tree costs go, you probably won't find much different to try and do a project in Somerville or in Newton or these surrounding areas, which is kind of unfortunate. But I guess I wanted to caution that the cost isn't always so generalizable, because they can be quite cheap in certain areas, at least compared to, other types of tree planting. But I want to encourage people to still pursue it. And I think for doing projects in surrounding areas, it would be really wonderful to do others in the Metro Boston area, in communities around here. We've also had, a wave of interest from other cities and towns in Massachusetts, and then kind of even further out near the DC area, near Illinois. And what I would say for that is, since the city of Cambridge and the Department of Public Works, in particular, and urban forestry, were such an important part of our process, I think part of the process that would be important in other municipalities would be to find kind of analogous support from urban forestry from city officials, and that would help with, the site, that could potentially help with the trees, with some of the costs, et cetera, because, Cambridge's desire to kind of have ambitious urban forestry plans and activities was part of how they were able to take this on, and hopefully other kind of cities around this area and beyond have similar hopes and kind of want to take on climate resilience in a similar way.
I think also another aspect of the success was that there was a pretty broad coalition of community groups that immediately were attracted to the idea. So that Green Cambridge, Mothers Out Front, the Rotary Club, the Cambridge Planting Committee, we had a visible coalition of groups, which in Cambridge, and I suspect in other cities and towns, really makes a difference in putting an idea forward.
So to answer the question of, can anyone label it a Miyawaki forest, or is there a process? That is a really excellent question, and one that came up many times in planning this out. Because in talking to Ethan and his experience planting Miyawaki forests, he's seen several communities either kind of have opening talks and try and learn about the method, and then go on to try and implement it themselves without further guidance, or people who kind of just take it from square one on their own and don't exactly do it right, have, a handful of species, but not kind of the biodiverse array that you want to aim for, or not even do the density of plantings correctly. And at that point, if a forest like that fails, it could be said that the Miyawaki method failed when it wasn't really the Miyawaki method to begin with. And that was definitely something that he expressed frustration with, and I think we sympathized with. And so we wanted to make sure we were doing this kind of according to all of the steps that were laid out, and according to the kind of guidance of real density, real biodiversity, and kind of making sure that we could actually call this a Miyawaki forest. And so I guess that is kind of my short answer of, you can call a forest whatever you want, but I think to be correctly Miyawaki and to kind of stand up to that name, it would have to have the density, the biodiversity, the kind of steps in place of a process like this. And yeah, I hope that I can kind of find out some more about examples like that of kind of correctly done Miyawaki forests, because that also helps, with research and evidence for why this can be an effective method, and not just add noise to the picture of how to do tree planting and how to do forestry. For lead time for sourcing the plants from New England wetland plants, I think we came kind of, I wouldn't say quite down to the wire, but even within the month leading up to planting, there was still some back and forth about plants. We would have liked more lead time, because that would have given them, I think, more of a chance to get some of the plants in higher quantities. So in some cases, there were either fewer than we would have liked, or certain species that we couldn't actually accommodate because New England wetland plants didn't have any. In some cases, they were made up for by the contributions from Russ or from Walter, but in some cases they weren't. So I guess it's possible to operate down to the wire of about a month, but a couple months before, we started talking with them months before, but I guess that back and forth went up until recently, or up until a little bit before the planting. Is that correct, Paula? Or I'm operating off of my memory. I guess the talks kind of did start longer back. And yeah.
maybe we could stop screen share and,
Yeah, I can
and
stop that, and I can pull it up again if it becomes relevant, but
sure.
And
So
Libby Shaw has raised her hand.
okay, I was also going to answer the question
Oh, okay.
and then, yeah, so we became aware when we found that New England wetland plants didn't have 1,400 of what we wanted, that
Right.
this might be time to encourage the start of nurseries, because if we really want Miyawaki forests to take off,
Mm.
the native plants have to be available. And one of the things that Walter Kittredge mentioned at the end was that if we knew we were going to be doing one next year, that we should let him know what he should start growing. And I think that that's in general. And it turns out that you can't just start it in a nursery, that it probably is 3 years before it's a size with a root system that can be planted. So I don't know how easy it's going to be for people to find the plants that they want on, definitely not on short notice, but and we had 50 species, and 34 is all that, is really needed for a Miyawaki forest. So I guess that's the time issue at any rate. I think all of us are going to have to be thinking ahead in order to make sure that the trees are there for the planting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That might be a reason why smaller forests might work, a patchwork of small forests, so that you can get trees in when they're available, if there aren't 1,000 available at once.
Mm, true.
Mhm.
There's a question in the chat about part 7 of the steps, saying that the Miyawaki forest would be the equivalent of a 100-year-old forest after 10 years. Could you elaborate on that?
sure. I guess
Where is that?
I think that's in this slide. So yes, I'm not sure that I have a long answer to satisfy this. My short answer is, I guess the 10 years is the mark of getting to a mature forest. But to be completely honest, I think the equivalence seems a little bit, I don't know, I guess dicey to me if you use different metrics of maturity, because 100-year-old forest or 100-year-old trees have been there 100 years. And so they tend to grow quite large and sequester a lot of carbon, do a lot of filtration. And so I'm not sure exactly where this kind of equivalency is coming from, other than potentially saying that, you have the relationships and the resiliency. But yeah, I think for that, I would just want to do more research and get back to you. Yeah, apologies that I don't have a very clear answer on that, because Paula and I have been batting around this issue of, what does maturity really mean and look like, because, the growth really is stark, but we haven't gotten the number of, tons sequestered or kind of metrics like that. So I'll have to, I guess, defer on this question, but thank you for bringing it up. I think it does raise that important issue of, like what is this forest going to look like and what is it going to do? I guess, how does it compare to old growth forests? Because it's not old growth, it's just kind of aiming to recreate those natural processes and relationships. So
Mhm.
I don't know if Libby had a question in the chat or if she wanted to say it.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you. This is a totally fascinating project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it turns out. But it does raise some interesting questions. When the Europeans first came to this continent, they found extraordinary forests that seemed very relatively empty of undergrowth. And it turned out that the reason for this was because the forests were actually being fairly intensively maintained by the Native Americans. They were being periodically burned. This did two things. First, it made it easier to hunt, and it also allowed a wider diversity of plants to grow that otherwise would be shaded out. If you go to a very old, mature forest, you'll notice that there's not a lot growing underneath the trees because the shade is kind of keeping everything down. So what it sounds like what the Miyawaki forest is being proposed as is something that sort of precedes the way forests were maintained by Native Americans. So it's going to be really interesting to see what this turns out to behave like and look like.
Thank you, Libby. That's very interesting. If you have any references that you can share on the condition of the forests and what is presumed about forest maintenance by Indigenous people, that would be great. Would love to see it.
Okay, yeah, I'll look that up. I mean, it's come up a lot with all the stories of wildfires, because it turns out that the forests out in the far west, the northwest, that were maintained by Native Americans using their traditional ways did much better, survived the forest fires out there much better than the forests that had been, quote, preserved and where forest burning had been prevented by the Forest Service.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Jess,
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say also, I mean, this is not a full answer, but kind of drawing on that point too, there is, it's tricky in some areas to determine what a native tree is. You know, is it native if it was here when Europeans came, or tracing back further than that? And so kind of getting that variety of sourcing on figuring out what species are appropriate in a region is kind of important depending on where you go and where you're planting. And I also, this reminds me that I don't think I have a graphic in these slides, but I should mention that the forest design also aims to have kind of 4 vertical layers of forest, starting with shrubs, and then a subtree level, tree, and canopy. So you're not actually kind of looking to put in a lot of that, ground level, I guess, like grass and ivy and things like that. You're kind of starting at the shrub level. But yeah, I guess I'm also, I guess part of it is also, yeah, we'll kind of see how that turns out. And part of our attempts at maintenance will be making sure that no kind of weeds come in and try and take all that nutrient away, and instead make sure that the plants themselves that are supposed to be there are doing that. And then after a few years, they're going to be established to the point where if weeds try and kind of come in to take in that space, they'll just be outcompeted because the plants have been growing for long enough and established well enough that they tend to kind of just be fine on their own. So
might also mention that we also tried to. Oh, sorry, Maya. I thought you'd finished.
I pretty much have. Sorry, I've just got errant thoughts all over the place. So
right. I know what that's like. Just going to mention that we also, I'm sure Ethan was also thinking about what plants might be more drought resistant, heat resistant, to focus on. And also I do remember when something came up about the Mashpee tribe recommending some species, and I was concerned that their ecosystem on the Cape is different from ours. And it turns out that, frankly, trees that we've been told are identified with a particular ecosystem, that isn't necessarily the boundary of where they are. That was a fairly arbitrary decision. And trees that are supposedly identified with one kind of ecosystem can do quite well in another one. So there was, that was another aspect of intuitive wisdom and knowledge that entered into the selection.
So for the kind of soil sampling question, we are interested in doing analysis. I think we're trying to decide how that will take place, whether the city will use, I know they have kind of a lab that they've worked with before, so whether the city will do the soil sampling or whether we should kind of make connections to research institutions nearby. But we are interested in making sure that we actually do have some sort of, laboratory testing rather than just looking at the trees. I mean, both are good ways of acquiring knowledge on the health of the forest, but we want to see the detail. But it's still, I guess, kind of undetermined right now who will be doing that. And that's something that we will have to kind of figure out with Andrew and his colleagues or with others. So for Lena's question of when volunteer maintenance will begin, we're looking to begin in the spring. So, weeds probably won't have, or we're kind of operating under the assumption that the winter, they're just going to sit there under the snow and then we won't really be able to easily get in there and kind of access the forest anyway. But once snowfall stops and kind of thaws out, we will start kind of leading maintenance teams. But I will get in touch either with, I'll start with the volunteers who have kind of signed up before, but also for new folks who weren't there for volunteering on planting day, I'll also kind of be making the rounds of collecting interest and just letting people know ahead of time, even these months ahead of time, that this is going to be starting up and kind of organizing people and their availabilities for that. So if you have interest, by all means, please reach out to me and I will also reach back out to this group as well. So I really appreciate that. And for Somerville planting, I'm not sure about Ethan, his availability. I know that they're doing quite a few Miyawaki forests on the West Coast this fall in, I think, Berkeley, California, down in LA, and kind of throughout the coast. But I will certainly kind of reach out and I can put, I don't know, would it be through this group? I can certainly put folks in touch, maybe Melissa, you directly, or if there's kind of a coalition of people, I can figure out who to connect and
Melissa
see.
here. So I
if-
guess I'm not sure that I'm the leader, but I'm the one who sort of is starting to try to make this happen. So yes, if you can put Ethan in touch with me, that would be wonderful. And then I can link him with everybody else who's interested. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, as mentioned, this would be great to see in Somerville and other areas. We've talked to many people kind of across different areas of Boston, Natick and Brookline and East Boston, seeing Watertown in the chat, and to have kind of a network of forests spread throughout our city, I think would be really great, because we have our different municipalities, but of course our shared climate resilience is shared. So the more we can kind of boost our biodiversity, and of course this is the Mystic Charles Pollinator Pathway Group. I don't need to tell you about pollinators and ecosystems, but I think that would be really fantastic. So yeah.
Maya, maybe you can put your email in the chat if you.
Yes, I'll do that right now, and I can kind of put a couple more links. one for just our page on the Miyawaki Forest, where we will also share some updates. We've got a few photos so far, but we're also kind of accumulating more. And there was some video footage as well that was taken on planting day, and someone that we're working with who's working on a documentary about the project and about the Miyawaki method. So we'll release information once that's further along there. And we've also got some kind of resources linked there of either coverage of this project or more info about the method and other examples. So that's kind of a main hub. And I will also link the Sugi page, which has some really nice images as well. I think Paula mentioned a couple of those. On the
What was-
question, you
I
go
did-
ahead, Paula.
I just wanted to see the question that was right before again. Ivan, what was your question there?
I had a question about whether Professor Miyawaki wanted these forests to be self-sustaining, or is there always going to be some level of hands-on, volunteer work that's needed?
Yeah, I don't think that we
So that
actually know
it
that.
is to have it. So in our case, after the ecosystem. Sorry, Paula.
I'm sorry, Maya, what did you just get?
I'll turn off my video again to speak. I was saying after 3 years, it's going to be self-sustaining. And that was the design of Professor Miyawaki to, I think in some examples, it's to the point where even visitors to a forest are asked to not even take a leaf. And it's sort of to that extreme extent of let the forest be on its own. That being said, I think depending on our context, we can be a little bit more lenient about it. We talked, for example, with the Mashpee about like foraging possibilities once the forest is self-established. And the idea is that, in the first few years when we're doing this maintenance, we are in there removing invasive species, making sure that we're doing the weeding. But after that time, once the forest is kind of more established than it is now, it has the kind of, I guess, boosted relationships, those kind of networks of nutrients. That means it will outcompete weeds for nutrients, even invasive species. So I mean, we're definitely not going to turn our backs on it, and we're treating this as kind of our proof of concept for a Miyawaki forest. So we'll see if, we're seeing invasives come in year 4 and start to choke out the plants. I don't think our plan is to leave it alone, but the idea is that we actually won't see such things happen. And I guess I'm kind of awaiting the results, much like everybody else, and looking to try and enact the method as faithfully as possible, including the self-sustaining part. But that being said, if things do turn out a bit different, if invasives are starting to take over, I think we're going to take that in course and adapt and try and still nurture the forest. Yeah, that's my thought. I don't know, Paula, if you have more to add there.
No, not at all. I was just wanting to mention that Miyawaki got the idea because he was looking around Japan as a young man to see what forests there were that had survived for a long time. And he noticed that at the Buddhist temples and monasteries, there were forests that had been there for hundreds of years that were incredibly strong and healthy. And so he studied their makeup, and that was how he developed the Miyawaki concept, actually. So you know, who knows? Maybe the monks were doing some maintenance, but that was not something that he seemed to think was going to be necessary, I guess. So that's my final image to leave you with.
Mm.
And we should let you go on with your meeting.
Well, thank you very much. And everyone can save the chat, but we all will be watching, and I think you'll get a lot of volunteers who want to maintain this. And I have student groups I'd love to bring by, so that would be exciting.
Okay.
That would be wonderful. Yeah.
So let's see what the sledding season has in store. I think the sledding hill is a little to the right anyway, so
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
probably.
it
Yeah.
is. Okay. And I don't think we mentioned that the volunteers, and there were close to 100, were organized into 8 areas, and there were 8 team leaders to help with the planting. Jean, you were one of the team leaders, weren't you?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, you weren't a team
no,
leader? Okay.
No, but I was in pie number 8, pie shaped.
Hi.
I'll tell
Okay.
you one thing I learned though, is I brought a small shovel, and halfway through I went back to my car and got the big one, and I ended up digging everybody's holes for them. They said, can you do this one here and this one? So I was the digger. But yeah, it was fun.
Okay.
Fascinating.
So thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll send any inquiries that come to us, I'll send off to you guys. So that's
Okay.
great.
Okay.
Are we making any announcements here? Brucey, Kim, Sarah? About December meeting and January meetings, or are we gonna hold off? Where's my colleagues here?
Here I am. I think we're going to hold off on announcements.
Yeah, okay, all right. That's good. So,
But I just want to say what a wonderful talk it was, Maya and Paula. Just delightful to hear about and exciting to follow.
Thank you, Brucey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Yes.
everyone, for coming.
Okay.
So if you put it on the map, we can give you a sign to put on it too. That says Mystic Charles Pollinator Pathway. So, all right.
Okay.
All right. So if any of our members have any comments, otherwise we can adjourn. What do we think? All right. Kim, you have a comment?
No,
Okay. All right. Well then, thank you all for attending, and that was really helpful, and we'll all see you anon. All right. Take care.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.